and you already kind of have to do that anyway,
Yeah,
right?
a combination of online and offline.
All right, but you not so much.
I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah, you're in a very different from them
Yeah.
because they're much more about building up their personality and having that personality resonate with their marketplace. You less so.
Well, in a sense, I think I'm trying to figure out how I can apply business stuff to what I'm doing and, make a name for myself. Like, ultimately, I'd like to be a novelist and be able to, have a following and all that sort of thing. But in the meanwhile, I'm trying to publish other things to get some income coming in and get started.
And just how do you see the two related? Outside of getting experience, because obviously you'll get experience, but
Basically, I just started with the nonfiction just to get the experience and because it was something that was readily to hand that I could get started with while I finish a novel. And I've also got some friends that are in the metaphysical community that I think I can help them publish and stuff. But it's really scattered so far and I'm not focused yet on what I really want to do. So.
okay. And on that note, like when you're writing the novels that you want to write, do they have an underlying theme or message?
That's kind of a metaphysical thing. It's going to be suspense, thrillers, kind of an underlying metaphysical thing to it.
Yeah, there's when you guys just look up like on Amazon, there's a book called like The Traveler, and I don't know who wrote it, Andy something. Are you familiar with those books? They're kind of parables. Is that it? Andy Andrews? Yeah. And so he has a following because of the message underlying the story, right? Not so much, it's a good story, but it's much more so the reason why people buy his second book, if they bought his first, is because of the message that they read that spoke to them.
That's kind of what I want to do is have it be an exciting story, but have some depth to it a little bit.
All right. Okay, so what I want to talk a little bit about, or what I want to share with you guys is some of the things I do in my reports, since it's just been front of mind, and I think it'll be helpful for all of you. For you, it'll be the same. You're just going to have to, I might have to stop and clarify how it applies.
Okay.
All right, and if it doesn't seem like it does, then you need to stop me so that I can make sure that it's clear to you, as clear it is to me, because it's clear to me, but sometimes I might not articulate it. All right, so there's a couple of things that I do in my reports that will be useful for all of you guys, right? And so at the end of the day, what I do in my reports is I create demand. Right, like when I wrote the Internet Business Manifesto, nobody was really looking for business training, but after they read it, they felt like they needed business training, right? So, and when I wrote even the Maven Manifesto, and we'll get you guys a tape of this, so don't worry if I go too fast or you can't see. That was about being an authority, which definitely, over time, a lot of people have kind of hopped on that bandwagon. And when I wrote the Entrepreneurial Emergency, it was about discovering what your constraint was as opposed to adding more potential, right? So, and that's the theory of constraints, TOC. So in all three of these examples, there wasn't really an underlying demand for what it was I was selling, and so I needed to create the context for people to see that that's what they needed, right? And so therefore I had to create the demand for it, basically. And so in order to do that, I do a lot of different things, but for what we're going to talk about here, I think a few things are highly relevant, right? So one is, I want to talk to you guys about Revelation. Oops, I'm a horrible speller. Revelation versus explanation. I want to talk to you about possible versus probable. And then I want to talk about underlying cause, because the books like The Traveler, they have an element of that, and there's probably underlying cause, and we'll do intersection of journeys. It'll be a little bit different for you, Julie, that one. And let's see. Counterintuitive. And there's a sub kind of note to that called social currency. And let's just see if there's anything else. All right. I would say conceptual, which we just actually sent some emails out about, but I want to go a little bit deeper into it. Conceptual versus experiential. All right. So when I write a report, I do a lot of different things, okay? But these are a few of them, and these few are some of the core drivers of the success I've had with reports. And a lot of this stems from a conversation, I don't know, a 3 or 4 hour conversation I once had. And it was a conversation I had with Mark Ford, who also has a pen name of Michael Masterson. And we were smoking cigars and drinking and going back and forth about our opinion about what marketing really is. Because we're both kind of theoretical guys, and this is how we like to spend our time, like coming up with broad theories about things that we do. And so these are all a subset of really what you're trying to accomplish in your marketing, right? Or in your writing, in your novels, in certain ways. So to kind of create a frame for it, one of the ideas that we were batting around back and forth was this idea that you have a business, right? You write a novel, right? Whatever it is, you're marketing a product, and you believe that the prospects in your world would be better off if they bought that product. So you believe that your prospects would be better, in a better place, if they were customers and not just prospects, right? Because of what you offer. And the hope is that you believe that not only because it's your product and you benefit from it, but that you actually just believe that, right? And that, you know, obviously we're all going to have some kind of bias, but that bias, hopefully your belief about your product transcends that bias. And then the question is why? Why do you believe that your prospects would be better off as customers? And why is it that they currently don't see that? Obviously, because they're still prospects. And, you know, Mark and I are talking about this, and, you know, we come to this conclusion that, well, your prospects don't have the same experiences that you have, right? Because if they had the same experiences that you had, they'd also have the same beliefs that you have, right? So part of the marketing equation or marketing process is to give your prospects experiences that you've had to lead them to the same conclusion that you've come to, right? To kind of give them an accelerated version of the experiences that have led you to that conclusion, right? And it's that process, right? How do you accelerate that experience so that they can come to the same conclusion? That really all of this kind of falls in line under. So the first one that I wrote down is revelation versus explanation, right? And you know, when I say revelation versus explanation, what I'm really talking about is, when I say revelation, is an epiphany or their idea versus your idea, right? So it's one thing for me to tell someone that it's much harder to succeed online as an opportunity seeker than it is an entrepreneur. That would be an explanation, as if I start telling them why. It is another story if I'm giving them a lot of different examples, showing them lots of stuff, and they come to the conclusion themselves. They have an epiphany, or they have the idea, right? So revelation is about getting your prospects to have the idea that they're better off with your product, right? Revelation could be a lot of other things too, but in this context, that's the revelation we're trying to cause. Versus explaining why, right? And this is the goal, though. The goal is to create an epiphany or a revelation, like where the idea occurs to them, just like it occurred to each one of you at some point, that they're better off with your product than without your product. The explanation is not something to be avoided. It doesn't hurt you to explain stuff. It's just that you want to go for this first, right? Because if you can get them to have the epiphany that they're better off with your product or service or your novel, versus you having to tell them that, it's much more powerful. So in everything that I do when I'm writing a report or any kind of significant marketing campaign, I'm looking to create the revelation. But I end by giving the explanation just in case they don't get it, right? Like, I want to make sure that we cover it. My preference is that they get it first, right? So that by the time I'm saying it, they're like, I got it already, right? But this is where I'm going. This is what I'm trying to create. And so the idea is how did I have the revelation? What experiences have really led me to that conclusion? What experiences have led me that herbology is the right way to treat irritable bowel syndrome, or that Weight Watchers is the best way to actually lose weight and keep it off, or that reading this nonfiction or fiction actually will help me in whatever path I'm pursuing, or even the best thing I could be reading tonight for myself, like just feeling better, right? Getting lost in it. And the way that's done can vary, but it generally will come down to either telling stories, right? Which, when we talk about stories, and we'll get into that a little bit, you know, these are stories with a point, right? They're not just stories. I have two daughters. They tell me stories, and the story is the point. There is really no other point other than they're telling me a story. But so these are stories that actually have an agenda, an underlying point. Yeah, I just dropped my daughters off at school, and they were busy telling me a lot of stories, and I'm waiting for the point, and there really is no point. That's why it's fresh in my mind. Like, okay, and why did you tell me that? I just thought you'd like to know, and I did. Anyway, so we do that with stories. I've done it a lot also, though, with exercises. You know, one that just stands out in my mind is that, like in the Internet Business Manifesto, for example, I had people go through what their goal was, how much they need to make an hour, and then reflect on that versus how much the work that they're doing, and is it worth that amount of time, that amount of money per hour. But really all of that was in the context of getting them to see that they were spending their time on things they shouldn't be spending on. Now, I could say that, and that's going to have some level of significance, but that's an explanation. If I get someone to do an exercise and they come to this conclusion that oh, in order to meet my financial goals, I have to do work that generates $75 an hour. And now I'm looking at this list of stuff I do that doesn't generate $75 an hour. I really shouldn't be doing this stuff. It's much more powerful. Like, they've come to that conclusion as opposed to me telling them, right? And that's this revelation versus explanation. I've also done it with visuals, like, just to use the Internet Business Manifesto again, like that visual of the U diagram has, you know, probably been the most successful diagram I've ever done. And it's also, it's a revelation that I'm doing too much, right? And what's been true in all of these reports, less true in some of the others, but the collection of them has certainly been that being problem focused is much more powerful than being possibility focused. And actually, Chuck and I are working on a report right now sort of about that, this is kind of a tangent, but I think it might be useful just as a general knowledge. We basically have two ways of motivating ourselves, right? We either motivate ourselves from an away from place or towards place. And the most successful people in life and the happiest people in life are towards people, right? I'm not a towards person. I'm trying to get there, but I've been successful as an away from person. But away from can only work for so long. Because, and I want to give you examples first. So what do I mean by this? I work out every day, right? I don't work out every day to have a good body. I work out every day so I'm not fat, right? Like, I have a business not so I can have, I don't have any big financial aspiration. I have a business so that I'm not poor, right? So away from is actually a more powerful in the short term, because we're much more clear about what we don't like than what we do want. And the problem though is that once you're not poor or not fat, you have no more motivation, right? Because you've now moved far enough away from the thing that really bothers you, right? But it is away from is the more powerful way in the short term. And it certainly is more powerful for most, because the majority of people are away from and they're not towards, right? If you ask people what they really want, a lot of times they're not clear. If you ask them what they're clear they don't want, they have a long list of things that they don't want. That's because they're very clear about what they don't want in their lives, and primarily because they sort their lives from away from, right? So the most successful reports I've ever written have all been reports about problems, not about possibility, right? We're much more invested in our problems than what is ultimately possible for any of us. And so when I talk about revelation versus explanation and using stories and exercises and visuals and whatever else, because there are other things down here that I also use for that and I'll explain, I'm talking about a revelation about their problem, right? A revelation about something that you, me, they have struggled with, right? Because that is the most powerful I have found of a revelation, right? That I've struggled with something and all of a sudden I have this epiphany or what have you about the reason why I've been struggling with it that I'd never thought of before, right? It's like the first time I read a book about ADD, right? I was told by a psychologist that I might have ADD. I didn't really take it seriously because I tend to hyper-focus, not thinking that that's actually symptomatic of ADD. And then 2 years later, I'm in a bookstore and I'm reading this book, Driven to Distraction, and it's listing out all the problems that someone would have if they have ADD, and I feel like this is my long list of gripes about myself, right? And I was so excited about it that I read that book that night, and then I handed it to my wife the next morning, and I said, read this, tell me if you think it applies to me, right? Because I was getting a revelation about what all these problems meant in my life. It wasn't that I was flaky and this and that, I was, but that there was this broader umbrella that we could put on top of it that said I had ADD, right? So it was a revelation about a lot of the struggles I had. And to me at that moment, it was very exciting because epiphanies generally are exciting, you know, hence these kind of words, epiphany, revelation, they have some emotional impact about the problems that I had been suffering through. All of a sudden I saw in a new light, right? It wasn't any easier to solve them, but I saw them in a new light, and that made me excited enough, right? And so we're gearing for that. Now, one of the things that I've been focused on a lot recently is this distinction, right? Possible, they all interrelate and we'll circle back, but possible versus probable. So there's a lot of things that relate into this concept, but to give the broader umbrella concept, there are many things that we all agree are possible in this world, but we don't necessarily believe that it's probable for us, right? So someone can start a business today and it can be $100 million business in 12 months from now. It's possible, it's been done countless times, right? I don't necessarily believe that I could do it, so therefore it's not probable. It is possible, right? But it's not probable, right? I don't think I can do it. You know, the Powerball lottery, it gets up to like $300 and $400 million. And when it does, there are long lines at the gas stations, people buying tickets. I believe also that it's possible that if I buy a ticket, I could win, but I'm not canceling like my appointments that day and standing online because I don't believe it's probable, right? If I believed it was probable that I was going to win, I would cancel everything on my plate and I'm standing in that line, right? But because I don't believe it's probable, if it's convenient, I'll do it, but I'm not going to go out of my way because I don't believe it's probable, right? Now, more so for you two, right? A little less for you. It applies to you, but in a different way. So we'll circle back. For you guys, if I've had irritable bowel syndrome for a while, I've done lots of things to try and solve it. And I haven't gotten the relief that I want, or I wouldn't even be talking to you. If I got the relief I want, we wouldn't even be having a conversation. And if I had lost all the weight that I wanted, right? Like I've already bought diet books, I've done Nutrisystem, I've done Jenny Craig, I've done all these things. And if any of them worked for me, we wouldn't be having a conversation. I wouldn't now be looking into Weight Watchers, right? So the biggest obstacle to getting someone to probable oftentimes is their own self-esteem, right? That they've actually tried things before and they haven't gotten the result. So why should this time be any different? And it's valid. That's a valid belief to walk around in the world with, because if you didn't walk around with that belief, you'd be buying everything all the time, right? And we know that most of the things that we buy are probably not going to get us that outcome that we want. And so one of the ways that we mentally opt out of an ad's claim is by, this doesn't really apply to me. You know, it's possible for other people to get that result, but I don't think I can get that result. I don't think that just because, you know, like let's take me for example, just because Rich is successful online, just because he's helped a lot of other people online, doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be able to help me be successful online, right? So it's certainly possible. I know he's done it and he's done it for a lot of people, but is it probable for me? Right? And if I can't get someone to believe that it's probable for them, then I don't get the sale, right? And I come at it from a sense that I'm probably one of the last people that is talking to them, not one of the first. So I have to deal with a bunch of disappointment, right? And so you'll often see in really crappy copy, well, in my opinion, crappy copy. It could work, but it doesn't work on me. It's not your fault. Right? You'll see that in copy all the time, like when someone's trying to sell something that is something along the same lines of other stuff they've bought before, and now they're telling them that the reason why you haven't been successful is, well, it's not your fault. Right? And to me, that's an explanation, right? I really want to get my readers, my prospects, to get a revelation that it's not their fault, to get them to see that they could have never been successful in what they were trying before, right? Because if they can see that, then they also have a different perspective when they're looking at new stuff. And I'm gonna frame both that work in my favor, right? So possible versus probable, really at the end of the day, this is about overcoming self-esteem. So, and most people have a low self-esteem, right? And, you know, I asked my oldest daughter's 10, right, Ava. I haven't asked her in a long time, but when she was 5, if I asked her if she played piano, she said, of course she plays piano. Now she doesn't really play piano, but she bangs on the, you know, on the keys and she's playing piano. You ask a kid 15 years old if they play piano, if they haven't taken lessons and they might have even be taking lessons, they don't necessarily believe they can play piano, right? That's because like self-esteem generally goes down, like, you know, as we age. You know, but probable for me is really powerful. And the reason I mentioned that book, like The Traveler, and he wrote another book. I read his other book, I don't remember the other one. He's using stories of people in worse situations than I'm in, right? And having a powerful ending to those stories that makes me believe that the outcome is probable for me, right? So it's same concept, just applied differently, because he doesn't have an agenda of selling me something at the end, whereas my reports do. But he has an agenda about getting the person to believe in themselves and taking action, and he's doing that through a story to create revelations about the reason why I haven't succeeded in the past, and if I did it differently, I could be, and if I did it differently, it could be probable for me, right? So one of the ways that I do that, right? How do I take someone from possible to probable and do it in a way that causes revelations are underlying cause, intersection of journey, and I would say conceptual versus experimental. So I want to talk about these three first.
These other books were The Heart Mender or The Noticer?
The Noticer is the other one I read, yeah. There's another one too, I thought.
There's a new one. Looks like he has a new one come out.
He's got several.
Yeah, they're good books. And they're actually written about the other coast, about Naples. So it has the Florida vibe, which, you know, if you live in an area, you generally tend to like reading books, or I do at least. I like to read books that are, I'm like, oh, I know that place. So anyway, okay. Underlying cause, which we will get to, well, I'm just debating which I want to start with. We'll start with underlying cause. All right, so I've tried to lose weight before and I haven't. I've tried to get rid of irritable bowel syndrome and I haven't. I've read other inspirational books and my life still sucks, right? So why is this? This has to be addressed. This is the elephant in the room, right? If you're going to get someone to buy into what it is you're offering. And the way I do it is primarily through underlying cause. And some of these other things are a way to get to that. And it's all about getting people to have the revelation that it's not your fault. That the things that you did in the past could not have worked, right? So it's not you, it's what you've done that's problematic. And I have this belief, right? I study a lot of spiritual stuff, and in a lot of spirituality, one of the underlying kind of themes is that reality is much more complex than we actually give it credit. So we assign cause and effect, we do all these things thinking that we have a handle on reality, and that's just really to keep us grounded. But we really don't know. Like the causes that we ascribe things to are one of many causes, so on, right? Bottom line though is that I'm coming at it from a mindset that reality is much more complicated than any individual really can appreciate, myself included, right? Which means that more often than not, what we believe is the cause of anything is not really the cause, deep down, the primary driver, right? So, and I could give you 100 biographical or autobiographical examples of my own life where I thought the problem was X, and then later on, when I had greater insight, I saw that that was just a small piece of the bigger problem, right? Whether they're relationships, business, what have you. I was looking at surface issues, and there were actually deeper emotional kind of things going on. So I also, when I studied hypnosis, one of my very first hypnosis teachers told me that when your client sits down in front of you and tells you their reasons why, right? Like, so someone's sitting down in front of me and they're telling me why they're overweight, that I should just nod my head and pretend like what they say matters, but it doesn't really matter what they're saying, because if they really knew what was going on, most likely they wouldn't still have the problem, right? So even in that context, it was basically, there's an underlying cause, the patient does not know what that underlying cause is, and they're going to give you a list of possible symptoms, but they have no idea what the cause is. And it's your job to not only surface that cause, then have them deal with it, so that they can then actually solve the problem long term. And that always stuck with me. It stuck with me in hypnosis, but it stuck with me in marketing too, because it was a very efficient way, right, to get people to see that it wasn't their fault. And if I could do it in a way where I caused a revelation, it would get them to the point that this approach is probable for me. No longer it's just possible, right? So that's how these all start to interact and kind of stack up. So in theory of constraints, and I don't know that, I think that, I can go up here. I can delete this. Okay, so in theory of constraints, which is primarily for manufacturing, that's how it first developed. And then it was starting, some very smart people started applying it to all types of businesses. And the concept was, in theory of constraints, is that there's always a bottleneck in any system, right? So one of the ways that I've often talked about it is that your body is a system, right? And the goal of your body is to live as long as possible, right? Well, generally, the whole body doesn't break down at one time. There's going to be one part of the body that breaks down that's going to cause it to have less of its goal than possible, right? So if I have a heart attack, then we could say that the heart was the constraint to living a longer life, right? And I could have worked on every other part of my body, and that would have all been a false efficiency. I wasn't really making anything better, because at the end of the day, it was the heart that actually was the bottleneck to living a longer life, right? So in the beginning, with theory of constraints, they were looking for bottlenecks, right? And when you look at it from a manufacturing perspective, it's rather simple. Like, this machine can do 10 units an hour, this machine can do 5 units an hour, this machine can do 3 units an hour. The whole system can only do 3 units an hour, because if those machines are dependent on each other, it doesn't really matter that this one can do 10 and that one can do 5. If this one that can only do 3 is necessary, then the whole system can only push out 3, right? So if we have a system that's putting sneakers together and everything else can be really fast, but they can only put so many soles on per hour, then they can only produce that many shoes based on the soles. But when it got into non-manufacturing, it became a lot more murky. Like, how do you really know what is the bottleneck when it's not as clear that, this thing produces 5 units, this thing produces 3 units, or whatever. And so they also appreciated that reality is very complex. They also had another thing, which is that there really is no conflict in nature. Like, nature never has conflicts, just is, right? So anytime we experience a conflict, it's generally there's some faulty assumptions going on, right? We come to the table with our own beliefs, our own expectations, and these things may or may not be true. and they wanted to figure out a way to get at those, right? To improve the business, right? This is all about business improvement. And so what they would do is they would create like a picture of the ideal business. Like if the business was everything that the people who had brought these people in was, like if it was ideal in every way, describe it, right? And so they would create a picture of what this ideal business would be, right? This would be for you, this would be the description of someone who is now living a life where they're no longer, right, and for you it would be their weight, and for you it would be whatever the topic is that you're writing the book about. Okay, so this is the ideal. And then right after they created the picture of the ideal, now they created the picture of the ideal for two reasons, okay? One was to create a boundary of what are we going to talk about? Because we're going to talk about why are we not at this ideal. So there might be lots of problems going on in the business, right? There might be lots of problems as it relates to the issues that you guys deal with, but we're not really interested in all the problems prospects have. We're interested in the problems that are interfering with the ideal, right? So by making a map of the ideal, we're starting to put a fence around like the conversation, right? If I'm going to help you with your business, and we map out like the ideal business for you, the fact that you have a bad relationship with your son is not relevant unless it's relevant for a reason in here, right? That you don't have your ideal business. And so we're not looking at every problem that our prospects have. We're looking at the problems that prevent them from having this, right? So that's why we map out this ideal business. This is the boundary for the system. And then the second is, now that we have this ideal, we start asking, well, why is that not the current reality? Why, what is preventing that from happening right now, right? So if I'm talking about it in a business context, it might be, well, projects are taking much longer than they should, or our copy isn't converting anywhere near as well as it should, or 150 other reasons, right? But it's related to, why doesn't your business look like this now, right? And maybe in an ideal business, there's a front end that is getting customers, acquiring new customers on a daily basis, right? And in the current business, there is no front end that's acquiring new customers, right? So then the question is, well, why not? And the business owner says, well, we've done lots of offers, but they've had all a low conversion. So we haven't been able to advertise effectively, and therefore we haven't been able to get new customers, right? So that would be like one reason, right? Low conversion, therefore, right? Can't advertise. And then I'd say, well, what's another reason? Well, it takes us a really long time to create a front-end product. All right, so it takes a long time to create blah, 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 right? And we keep going. So in theory of constraints, when we have this list, we look at this list as the symptoms. These are not the reason, this is not the real reason why the current is not the ideal. These are just the symptoms that are preventing the current from being the ideal. And we want to have a better understanding of these symptoms, right? We want to understand what's really the cause of these symptoms. And so what we generally do in theory of constraints is we do a root cause analysis with all of these issues. And generally there'll be more than two. There'll be, I don't know, anywhere from 5 to 12. And the very first time that I did this methodology, I realized that a lot of the problems in my business at Strategic Profits were stemming from the fact that we had a launch-based business model. I had the symptoms I started out with had nothing to do with launches. It had to do with poor customer support. This is years ago, right? It had to do with lack of efficiency with team members. It had to do with a bunch of stuff. But as I started, I put these symptoms up here, symptom 1, symptom 2, symptom 3, and so on. And I started to say, well, why do we have bad customer support? Right? Well, we have bad customer support because they come, like customer support issues come in peaks and valleys, right? So they're either overloaded or underutilized, right? And then, well, why is that? Because all our sales come in peaks and valleys. Well, why is that? Because currently we don't make many sales outside of launches, and launches, when we do sell, we have an influx of new customers, blah, 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 blah. And why is that, right? And so I just kept going. And as I kept going on all these symptoms, it became very clear that one of the biggest reasons why we were having all these problems in our business, right? Because the reason why, when I had the ideal business and the current business, in the ideal business, we had customers that had a much higher lifetime value, right? And in our current business, we had a lower lifetime value. And when I was looking at those two and asking myself why, what symptoms were preventing it, we had really poor customer service. Well, if we have really poor customer service, then the likelihood of having high customer value is not very good, right? So that's why it got on the board. And then as I started to ask myself why and why and why and why, it came down to launches were really the biggest cause of our customer support problems, because we just couldn't scale and then go back and scale and go back. It wasn't easy for us. And these other symptoms all also kind of related back to launches. And that's generally what happens. When you look at current versus ideal, you have these random reasons that are all symptoms, but when you I want to shift gears for 1 second and I'll go right back to it, okay? Well, no, I'll finish the thought first. When you stack up all the symptoms and you start asking why, there's something called convergence of cause, right? Which means basically that as you're going deeper and deeper and deeper, you notice that there are less issues actually causing more of the problem. So, I start out with customer service, I end up, because we're launch-based, and then I look at the team being ineffective the majority of the time, and I'm also noticing that that relates back to launches, right? So all of a sudden now, two big symptoms are all being caused by one deeper problem, right? They're converging. The causes are converging into one, right? Or two or three. If you start with 12, you might only have one primary cause, or you could have two or three, but you're gonna have less than what you started with, right? The tangent I was gonna go on is that Jay Abraham is writing a new book with a friend of his, and we've had a lot of discussions about it because it's a book about how to think better, and he wasn't very knowledgeable about this prior to working with this guy who's writing the book with, but I've been very knowledgeable about it, so that's why we've had lots of conversations about it. I was sharing my thoughts about it, and the conversations were about, and like I said, I'm such a bad speller, I hope this is even close, divergent versus convergent thinking, because they're two different styles. And they're both very useful at different times. Divergent thinking is like brainstorming. Let's come up with 100 different reasons why our prospects are not where they want to be, right? Convergent thinking is saying, okay, what do these all have in common? How can we now bring these closer together? So generally, when I'm addressing a problem, I will do both, right? I'll start with divergent thinking, like brainstorming all possibilities, and then I'll reduce it down through convergent thinking. And it's just two different thinking methodologies, right? Here we're primarily talking about convergent thinking. But divergent thinking is useful in dealing with symptoms. Like, what are all the reasons why? So I'm doing all this because I want to find a deeper reason why my prospects haven't had the success that they're searching for, you know? And the better I'm able to do this job, the easier it's going to be to create the epiphany or revelation that it's not their fault. So I'm going to give you a total hypothetical made-up example, right, that has no truth in it, just because it's one I've used many times before. And that is, let's say that you have information overload, you've got papers all over the place, you hoard stuff, clutter, your desktop is a mess, you've got about 20,000 emails in your email box, and you've tried to get a handle on this, and yet up to this point you've been ineffective, right? You've done getting things done with like the pretty colored folders and the nice printed out tabs. You've done the Franklin Covey planner, and you have had that. You've done all these things, and you're still not anywhere further along. Well, if you can kind of get your head around that problem, and I can because I have that problem, then you know that the power of like someone telling you touch it once is not that powerful because you've heard it before. It's common wisdom. It doesn't resonate. You know, it might be what's necessary, but like, tell me something new, right? It's like, you know, for weight loss, it's the easiest. Don't just tell me I need to eat less and exercise more, right? Like, you're not telling me anything I haven't heard before, right? You got to tell me something new, or I don't have any reason to be listening to you. And so I've tried all these things to overcome my info overload problem, and I still have it. And I still have clutter all around and all this kind of stuff. Now, what's going to get me to go out and buy another thing, right? I've already done all these things. They haven't worked. David Allen, Getting Things Done, the Franklin Covey Planner, Trying to Touch It Once, and probably 20 other books that I've, courses and whatever. Well, I have to do something if I want to sell that person, right? Like, there has to be some reason why they failed before, and this is going to now work, right? And this is where I always go. I go to the underlying cause. So an underlying cause might be in this specific issue, which is totally not true, right? Like, I've never done any research or anything, but it's that you have an information esteem problem. You don't really trust your own ideas as much as you trust the experts and their ideas more so than your own. So as long as you have this, you're always going to be holding on to outside information. You're going to find it very difficult to get rid of it. You're going to find it very difficult to delete the emails that come in. You're going to find it very difficult not to save everything on your desktop because you believe that there's better information in there than there is in your mind. And as long as you have that belief, you're never going to let it all go, right? Now, like I said, I don't know if that has any truth in it, and I wouldn't release anything that I didn't believe to be 100% true. But if that paces someone's experience, right, which I'll explain how through this, conceptual versus experiential, if that paces someone's experience, and I can describe what it's like to have an info esteem problem, like how would you know whether you had it or not, now all of a sudden, a light bulb turns on in their head saying, no wonder none of this stuff has worked. This is why all those things didn't work for me. Now I finally have hope that this new thing can work for me because I now really understand the deeper problem, right? And everything else I've been doing has been trying to treat a symptom when this has been the real problem, right? Just like I felt when I'm reading about how, you know, ADD, right? And how I could start cleaning up my home office, fall upon a magazine, and end up now spending the next 7 hours sitting on the floor of my home office reading the magazine and not getting the office clean, right? And I thought it was just me being flaky or what have you, and now it was a list of one of the symptoms of ADD, and now the problem isn't my flakiness in the moment, the problem is I have ADD, right? So it's now I understand that behavior better through the lens of the deeper problem, right? And that lens of the deeper problem makes me have newfound belief that I can get the outcome, right? Right? So the Driven to Distraction book didn't tell me that I had ADD. They just painted a picture of these are the things that people with ADD have. This is what they do. This is how they experience life, right? And as I'm reading this, more and more, it's becoming more and more clear to me, I have ADD, right? Which means that maybe, in my mind, this is where my mind's going at the moment, maybe if I treat the ADD, then I won't sit and get distracted by that magazine. I won't have the other issues that they're talking about because now I'm understanding why they're occurring, right? And now that I understand why they're occurring, it's also explaining why the stuff I've done in the past has not been effective, not useful, right? Because they didn't address the core problem. So I'm hoping that these are starting to gel, like in your minds, right? That by getting someone to see that there's an underlying cause, right, to whatever problem that they're experiencing, right, it gets them to have the revelation that everything that they've done before is not their fault, right? And because they have that revelation, combined with a new perspective, they go from possible to probable, right? Like when I was reading that ADD book for the first time in years, I thought like I might be able to actually get a handle on this stuff, right? Later on, it occurred to me that it was probably going to come through drugs and medicine, and that. But in the moment, I didn't even think about that. I was just so excited about the fact that all these things that I'd been struggling with could potentially be solved, right? And that was such a powerful experience for me. How that could be solved didn't even occur to me. It was just they could be solved, right? And so all of a sudden, I had a boost in self-esteem, right? Because I was realizing that these could be solved in a way that I had never considered, that I had never tried, which is why these things in the past hadn't been probable, and now it could be. Okay? So, I'm going to go here first, conceptual versus experiential, and then we'll go to intersection of journeys, and then we'll talk about counterintuitive and social currency. So conceptual versus experiential. And this actually, this is the difference between tell and show. So I have a thesaurus in my back office, right? And it's called the Emotion Thesaurus. And it's for novelists. And it's for novelists to be able to show more so than they tell. So instead of saying that, telling would be, John was nervous, right? Nervous being what we're telling them. If I look up nervous in this Emotion Thesaurus, it's going to say all the ways that someone would display nervousness, right? So their heart starts palpitating, right? Dry mouth, beads of sweat form on, their brow. Their voice gets a little shaky. All the ways so that if I wanted to have a character display nervousness so that the reader could have the revelation that the person is nervous, not the explanation, John was nervous, right? This is the way I would create that, right? So, one of the ways, so most of us feel in certain areas of our lives misunderstood, okay? Like just take it as fact, right? That if you really knew what it was like being me, or if you really knew my problem, or if you really knew the things I was struggling with, blah, blah, blah. So it's too easy when we're talking about anything that we do for us to be talking about it on a conceptual level, and for prospects to totally discount it because it doesn't necessarily apply to them. So I'll give you an example. We could be talking about info overload, for example. Info overload is a concept, right? How do you know if someone really has it? So if I'm reading something and it says cure information overload, it really doesn't have any emotional oomph to it. It has no impact because it's conceptual. But if I start to actually talk about the feeling, right? That you feel like there's so much that you need to learn and you have it all, but you can't, there's never going to be a time when you even could get through it all, because each day more information is coming and you don't have a way of dealing with that, and yet you have all this old stuff. And now you're trying to figure out which is really useful for you to be consuming, which isn't, and you can't make that distinction. And so you do your best, but you end up spending your time on stuff that's totally irrelevant, and you know that deeper down in this pile of stuff, there is stuff that you actually need. And it's very frustrating and blah, 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 blah. Now, the better I'm able to describe that experience, the more that someone is going to have the feeling that this person is talking about me, right? This is my problem, right? You know, it's one thing for me to read in the ADD book, gets distracted, right? That kind of can just pass right by me, right? But telling the story of cleaning out a room, picking something up, and then getting totally lost in that thing to the detriment of the bigger project, and now that bigger project being totally gone, is the same thing as saying distracted, but now it's much harder for me to dismiss if I've had that experience, right? So it's because distraction in this particular case would be an explanation, right, to cause the revelation that I've been distracted. I'm now reading something about that experience, right, the experiential, right? And by reading about it, I can see how it applies to me, right? So along the conceptual versus experiential, a lot of people tend to make it more difficult to get into the experiential side. And it really is not that difficult. And the reason it's not that difficult is because if you embrace this belief, it's from a quote that has been attributed to too many people, so I really don't know whoever said it, but it's that which is most personal is most general. Right? And when I read that quote, to me, what it meant was that the things that I believe are most personal to me, the struggles I have, the doubts about myself I have, the fear I have, what have you, the things that I'm least likely to share with others are the things that they are most likely to have experienced themselves, right? And so a lot of my best reports, the best writing I've done, is when I have written about my personal experience in a way that I wasn't even ascribing it to myself. So I was talking about in third person. Many people will have this experience, right? I didn't even share that it was my experience at one point because I didn't feel the need to, right? It wasn't useful for that explanation for me to ascribe myself to that situation. But by describing it, readers would read it and be like, he's talking about me, right? And when you have that feeling that this person, if you've ever had this experience, I've had this experience a lot of times where I'm reading something and I get this charge because all of a sudden I feel like they're talking about me. They're talking about my problem, right? You know, it can go the other way too. They talk about like med students in their first couple years, like thinking that they have every disease, right? Because it's the same issue. This is me. I have those symptoms, right? So same thing, right? Used a little differently, but we all have the experiences. That's my point. And it's just about grasping into those. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just ask a bit, so is it more helpful to frame it in terms of explaining it? So using IBS as an example.
Yeah.
I have a story which is quite personal,
Mm-hmm.
and it's something that a lot of people are embarrassed to talk about
Mhm.
because you have IBS and then you talk about it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So is it more helpful if I say, this is my story, this is what happens to me, or this is a story that a lot of people have experienced?
It depends on context, and we'll talk about it, because intersections of journey is where you tell your story,
Right.
okay? But I don't, so I use that, but I do it when appropriate. And we can talk about when it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate. But I do it a lot more than just in the intersection of journeys. And what I'm trying to do is to get prospects to have the thought that this person is talking to me. What I'm reading right now is very relevant to my own life. And if you do that even in like nonfiction or even spiritual, it becomes very powerful. Because, like I said, I read a lot of spiritual books, and when I feel like what this person is saying is very much related to what I'm experiencing or what I'm trying to experience, all of a sudden I'm much more invested in the, in it, right? Because this is me, right? So I go from conceptual to experiential by tapping into my own personal experiences. And they don't even have to be the same personal experiences. They can be slightly different, but the meaning and the feeling being the same, and that's enough, right? Because if you can get the meaning and the feeling on, then when the person reads it, the example that we wrote about in one of our reports, which is not specific to this, but just to explain the power of it, it's like if you had this weird problem where you get this pain in your elbow and it goes to your shoulder and then somehow it travels around and goes to your wrist, and you've gone to a bunch of doctors and they all think you're crazy, and then you're sitting and talking to some world-leading orthopedist and you say, I'm sorry to bother you, but can I just ask you a question, because I've went to all these doctors and they think I'm crazy and I have this weird pain and it starts here and it goes there, and if they finish the sentence and then they say it ends at your wrist, you'd be like, oh my God, I just found the person that I've been looking for all my life, right? So that's what we're trying to create. When we say that, which is most personal, is most general, we're trying to pace, right? Describe their current experience of the world, right? And we're using our own disappointments, our own frustrations, our own whatever, right? To tap into that. So you might not have ever struggled with your weight. It doesn't look like you've ever struggled with your weight, but there are times when you've probably been embarrassed to go somewhere, right? Not maybe for your weight, but for some other reason. Well, I have been fat, and there have been times when I've been embarrassed to go somewhere because I was fat. So you can describe the situation of embarrassment and not wanting to go somewhere, and that'll be enough, right? You don't have to say the whole story, right? Because if you can tap into the emotional aspect of it, it's powerful enough, right? I don't have irritable bowel syndrome, right? But I have had times where I've been embarrassed by my own bodily function. And my wife her parents have a house up in the Canadian, like up way north, and it's a little cabin, and the kitchen is right alongside the bathroom. And so this is I don't feel, if everybody's in the kitchen, I don't feel comfortable going to the bathroom all of a sudden. Now I'm holding it in and I feel horrible and all this. So I know what it's like that, right? And if I could talk about like this feeling of embarrassment, of shame, of, feeling uncomfortable, like that would be enough, right? Because it would pace with maybe your prospects probably experience things like that a lot more often, but I've experienced one, so that's enough for me to describe it in a personal, emotional way, right? And there's a gazillion examples spiritually. I don't know if you need me to give you one, I would gladly. Under the context of happiness and not feeling happy and trying to appreciate fully why I'm not feeling happy, even having knowledge that I probably should be happy based on everything, and now a description of you have all these things in your life, you think that this was what was important to you, and yet you find yourself sitting there like surrounded by your stuff, right? Things that you all thought at different points in time were going to bring you to happiness. And yet here you are sitting here not wanting to engage in any of those things and wondering why, right? Wondering what is it finally going to take, because you're looking at all these things that you thought were going to make you happy and you're not happy now. You were happy maybe when you purchased them, but now time has elapsed and all these things that you thought were going to bring you happiness have not. And you're sitting here somewhat alone in your unease, knowing that you should be happy, that there's nothing preventing you from being happy, and yet you're still not happy, right? Now, that's going to resonate with someone who's had that experience, right? So that's the point. Like, it's taking a concept, unhappiness, embarrassment, you know, whatever, and breaking it down to making it more real, making it experiential. Because it's much, if you can, I want to circle back for a second. When you're talking about something that's experiential, if the person buys into it, like, that's happened to me, right? You've also gone from possible to probable, right? Because now, when I'm saying that this is possible, right? And you now have an understanding of why you haven't gotten it before, right? And I'm also making it clear that I'm talking to you specifically because I'm describing your experiences. Now I start moving more and more to this is probable for me because this person's talking to me. They're describing my experiences, right? They're telling me the reason I haven't been successful before, and that makes sense, right? And they're saying, you know, when I do underlying cause, I'm saying, I'm giving them this underlying reason, and then I'm also saying, you know, if you might have tried this, that, or the other, it probably didn't work for you. And here's why, right? You have this info. So now, whether they tried it or not, if they have tried it, they're now saying, okay, this person gets me. They're explaining why, like all the other things I've tried haven't worked, right? And all of a sudden now, there's a shift in me, right? Because I understand this deeper reason. This person's also explaining stuff the way I've experienced it. It becomes very powerful, right? I get now all of a sudden that it's totally not my fault. Like, I can actually solve this. I've just been going about it the complete wrong way. So that covers, you know, for the most part, we'll circle back, but it covers these. So intersection of journeys is more your story. It's what you're talking about. You might not have this story, but you could always use somebody else as an example. And same with you, depending on the topic of the book, right? But the goal is to also help go from possible to probable, to give some legitimacy to whatever underlying cause that you believe is the real underlying cause, and to give you a space to talk about the experiential is to tell your story, right? And the goal of telling your story is, you know, if this is your story, right, and we could make it on the way up, like to show that it gets better, but it's not really important. We want a story that the prospect, like, can identify with. Like, there are parts of the story that make them feel like this person's lived what I've lived, right? This guy Andy does it in his books really well, like, you know, and it's not hard. Like, once you really grasp like what's going on here, it's the concepts that once you understand the concepts and when you're reading the books, you're now not only feeling the feeling, if it's effective, you're now understanding why you're feeling the feeling, right? If that makes sense. So, you know, in my webinar, for example, but in my webinar, so if you read the manifesto, I don't have really an intersection of journey. I talk about it a little bit, but I don't harp on it. And I'm much more third person biographical than I am autobiographical. On the webinar, I'm much more autobiographical. And I go through these 9 different like pain points that I went through. And the goal of that is to have a intersection with their life. And maybe they all intersect, and that would be phenomenal, or maybe a few intersect, which is good enough, right? Because especially if I'm describing these points in an experiential way, then what tends to happen is that, you know, okay, I'm the expert, so they see me up here. They feel down here. And if they get a sense that I was where they are, then that also makes it easier to believe that they can get there, right? Because the implication is, hitch your wagon to me, because I have been exactly where you are, and I'm here now. I can help you get here, right? That's the whole underlying premise of having an intersection of journeys. The reason to tell your story is so that they see themselves in your story, see where you have ended up, and now can just automatically, the leap happens in their mind. This person can take me there because they understand me. I've had the same experiences they've had, right? They've had success, right? I now understand why I've been failing, right? And I've had numerous revelations about some of these issues, and also they're describing it in a way that really fits with my experience. And yet they're here, and I'm here. This must be the person I need to get information advice from, right? And like I said, it doesn't have to be your own story. It could be a story of someone who you've helped, right? Or what motivated you to get into the business in the first place. You know, an overweight mom, overweight wife, girlfriend, brother, sister, whatever. But they were able to make the change. And if you describe the situations in a way that it fits with their reality, same thing, right? So that's the intersection of journeys. And you'll probably, in your novels, that'll actually be something that you might want to really get your head around, because the more that you're able to pace someone's experience, the more they're going to buy into any book. There's, in hypnosis and in NLP, there's something called pacing and leading, right? And if you hear someone that's really, really good at it, they're incredibly effective at persuasion, right? And what they do is they'll do like pace, 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 lead. I'll give you an example in a second. Pace, 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 lead. Then pace, 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 lead, lead. Pace, pace, lead, lead, lead. Pace, lead, 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 right? So pacing is like the current experience. Like you're sitting there with your, feet on the floor, your arms on the armrest, and you're in this office, and you're thinking, like, now this is a leading statement, right? Or you're excited about what you're going to hear the rest of the day, right? And now I'm going back to pace. And, it's getting warmer in the room, whatever. But someone who does it well, I can't do it well, or I would go give you a full example. Someone who does it well, every time they're making a statement about what you're currently experiencing, it creates a little bit of momentum in what you're listening to, and then they're throwing in this additional statement that's not entirely true yet, but it's now surrounded by more pacing statements, and so it starts building momentum and pushing you in the direction of where they're saying the leading statements. So here, all of this, experiential, talking about the intersection, like all the points of the intersection are all pacing statements basically, right? And the underlying cause is giving them a new context for a lot of the things they've experienced. And the leading statement is getting them to see now that it's probable for them, right? By showing them examples of success of people who've had the same issues and your own and all those kinds of things. So it's incredibly powerful. I mean, that's why, there's so many types of stories of like rags to riches and stuff like that, because we like stories like that, right? It gives us hope, right? And hope is a really powerful part of this entire process. Just to go back to my ADD experience, when I was reading in that book, all of a sudden I had newfound hope that I could finally overcome these things because of the way it was being described, and it fit my reality, and right, like all of a sudden I was feeling more and more hopeful, right? So the webinar is a pretty good example of it. I'm trying to do two things at the same time. I'm trying to remove all hope from the current approach while building hope in a new approach, right? Because great book by Eric Hoffer, I forget the name of the book. I can pull it up, I think. I might have even given it to you guys. But people can't live in a state of no hope. It's one of the most destructive places to be, right? As long as we have hope, we can kind of deal with a lot of crap. But the removal of hope is a very uncomfortable place to be. And so when I'm taking someone through a webinar or something like that, I'm trying to remove all hope of the current approach, like that, or all the approaches that they've tried before, which they're willing to give up hope on because it hasn't worked anyway, right? And then, but remove all hope that it will work and then provide a new thing, right? So that, like, you want to latch onto it, right? Because that's kind of, at some point you get hopeless, right? It might be the 20th diet. It might be the 20th time management system I bought. But at some point, you lose hope, right? There's a seed of hope that you're someday going to find something, but you're in a bad place and about that issue. And if someone can provide new hope, it's rather exciting, right? Like, you feel rather different. So these are all elements that I use in writing a report, but really in any kind of marketing message that I do. You'll see me use a lot of these different elements. Not possible to probable, because that's not really an element, that's really what I'm aiming for. But underlying cause, the whole opportunity seeker thing is an underlying cause, right? It creates an umbrella around a lot of behaviors. Just like ADD is an umbrella around a lot of behaviors, right? They can't test for ADD. So it's described by just a lot of behaviors, right? I'm reading a book right now about sociopaths and psychopaths, and same thing, there's no blood test for a sociopath or a psychopath, it's all behavior-based. So by taking a group of behaviors and putting a definition on it, which is what psychiatry does all the time, right? That's why the DSM-V has grown from like this to that. There are all these conditions that they have no way of ascribing whether someone has it or not, except on symptoms, and those symptoms are all behavioral, right? So that makes it very easy for marketers to do the same, because that's what they're doing in pharmacology as well, right? So does that make sense? That could be, okay. All right, so then the last thing that I just wanted to share with you, because it came up yesterday, and I never really described it this way, so I thought I'd like to for you guys. Someone asked me why some of my reports have gone pretty viral. And I believe it's a combination of these two things. And I've spoken about both of these things. Most of the time when I speak about them separately. But I think there's a compounding effect of these two things. And one is counterintuitive content, right? And the other is social currency. So let me first just kind of describe what they are. Counterintuitive content is the opposite of common wisdom, right? So when Atkins, Dr. Robert Atkins first came on the scene, and he said, you can eat, don't eat carbs, eat fat and protein, and you're going to lose weight. That was very counter to what everyone else was saying. So it automatically gets people's attention. Like, what? Right? Like, there's an ad, there's a magalog that is an Agora magalog that says, it's like a doctor on the cover, and it's like, smoke cigarettes, drink coffee, and stop drinking water and live to 100 and some odd years old. It's such a counter proposition. You're like, what the hell is this guy talking about? And then you see that he's a doctor, which makes it that much more counter, right? I tell, I have this process where people can work a lot less and get a lot more done. So cut your hours in half and double your productivity is somewhat counterintuitive. How can you do that, right? So counterintuitive is anything that is not expected, really, right? So anything that is a juxtaposition of what would commonly be expected. Spend less time writing, but write more. Or, anything that just doesn't jive with what we've heard before, right? Fight a cold by going outside without a jacket on. Like, how does that happen, right? So counterintuitive what I found when I was writing reports was that counterintuitive content, and I've tried to put counterintuitive content in every single one of my reports, is that it gives a reason for people to read. Because they're reading something that is different than they've heard before, which is sometimes exciting if you're talking about a problem or an outcome that people want, right? So just the fact that it's counterintuitive is useful from that standpoint. But there are other elements to it. Another reason why I always use counterintuitive content, or try to, is that there's a underlying subtext to using counterintuitive content, which means I know things that you don't. Because if I'm sharing something like, if you've never heard that you can eat fat to lose fat, and now you're hearing it for the first time and you're interested in losing weight, what else do you know that I don't know, right? Like, because I never heard that before, right? Like, you know, so all of a sudden, it's kind of a way of proving that I know stuff that you don't, by sharing stuff that you not only don't know, but probably would have never occurred to you going forward as well, which is also powerful. So it's not only do I not know this, but the likelihood of me ever hearing this, if I didn't hear it from you, is pretty slim, right? Which gives me a stronger reason to listen to you, right? Now, you know, it's on the blog, and I think we've put out some emails about like the steps I go through to create counterintuitive content, so we don't really need to go in depth there because they're all like publicly available. But social currency, I've talked about, but I haven't talked about in a while. And social currency is, as it kind of sounds, it's currency that you can use in a social basis, kind of as a conceptual idea. So a joke is social currency. If I tell you a funny joke, and you know it's funny, and you feel it's funny, and you remember it because you want to share it with other people, that's a form of social currency. When you share that joke, I've just given you something that's like a social lubricant that you can use, and when you share that joke, people will think you're funny, right? So it's social currency. You know, and it doesn't only have to be something funny. It's like you could read something very fascinating about whatever your friends are interested in, and now you know this thing, and you're gonna talk about it the next time you see them. It makes you a more interesting person, so knowing that thing makes you more interesting, right? So it's a form of currency in the sense of that it has worth, and it has worth in a social context. Well, counterintuitive content, when related to an area that our prospects, readers, what have you, are invested in, right, when done appropriately, is social currency. So one of the reasons why the manifesto went viral was that there was counterintuitive content in it that when the reader read it, they felt they were more knowledgeable about certain things than their friends and peers, and they were interested and eager to share those things because it made them more interesting to share them. And then at some point the conversation went to, where did you learn that stuff? Oh, I read this free report. So they weren't sharing the report because, for me, they were sharing the ideas that they got in the report because it made them more interesting and seemed more knowledgeable. And by sharing those things, it led people back to the report, right? So these two are very much in line. The challenge is to think about what things are your prospects most likely to want to share, right? And if you're in a market, you know, like I don't know if people with irritable bowel syndrome have lots of friends who have irritable bowel syndrome, like if they congregate together or not. If they don't, then that will be a little less powerful for you. For a book, it's totally like, I mean, one of the ways that a book gains traction is people are either talking about the book or they're talking about something in the book that leads to a discussion about the book, right? And if they're talking about something in the book, generally the book can go much further, much faster, because they have their own agenda, right? One is your agenda. You know, it's my agenda to have the manifesto everywhere, but that doesn't, my prospects aren't going to help me with that. But if sharing some of the ideas in the manifesto makes them seem more smart around their friends, now all of a sudden they're going to share it. So if you look at my reports, I always try to, there's always counterintuitive content, And the rationale behind that is, one, I know things you don't, right? Two, make it a more interesting read. And three, give them stuff that makes them more interesting by sharing. Because if I can do that, it'll spin more. And so all of this, you can say, falls under the title of educational selling, right? This is really what I believe is one of my sweet spots, one of the things I'm really good at. That would be as opposed to impulse selling, which all purchases at the end of the day are made by impulse. But what causes that impulse? Is it hype and promise, a good story, or is it an education? There's nothing, each has its place, right? I'm good at the education side. So I'm good at selling higher price stuff, right? Back end stuff, all kinds of things like that. Anything where I have the space and the time to educate, you know, a one-page sales letter or a two-page sales letter, I'm gonna have a hard time because I can't do any of this stuff, right? I'm not gonna be able to do a lot of this. Now, I think, obviously I'm biased now, I've told you this, that this is really my area. I also believe though that it's more and more where the world is going anyway. When people get online, they're less looking to be sold. They might want to buy something, like go to Amazon, buy socks, buy, you know, whatever. But when they go to a website, they really want to be educated. They're looking for information. And once someone is looking for information, they're in my realm now, right? I can now have them go through some of these things in a way that works for me. And so we've covered all this, and I just want to cover one last idea, then we'll take a break, and then I guess we'll go into each of your businesses and kind of talk about it. But there's ideally, you want as many roads that kind of lead to your business as possible. And so, you know, what happens? Well, I was talking to someone on the BGS call on Wednesday, and this person heard an interview that I did with Paul Lemberg. So Paul Lemberg had interviewed me. We did like a 3-hour thing to his list because he hadn't done anything for his list in a long time, and he asked me if I could just do him a favor, and him and I will just kind of talk business. I was like, yeah, sure, no problem. So they heard that, and they were interested in what I had to say. And I'm sure some of the things I had to say were some of the things that I just mentioned there, because that's what I do, right? So interested enough so that then he joined Founders. And then after Founders, he was in Founders for a while, he joined BGS. And he's considering now like one of the higher end things, right? So this is inside the business, right? But outside the business, we have a lot of different places where we are, right? Facebook, YouTube, there's tons of blog posts on other people's sites about many of my reports, and so on and so on and so on, right? So it's kind of like having all these circles out there, like breadcrumbs leading people to our business. You know, and I talked about this a little bit in the Profit Hacks kind of launch. My personal belief, and it's kind of intertwined with who I am, so I will admit to the fact that it also plays to my strengths, and it also fits how I consume stuff. My success has come from having a few great pieces out there that have done 90% of the work for me, right? So that's like, you know, whatever, the Manifesto, the Attention Age Doctrine 2, and stuff like that. And they've stood the test of time long enough that, you know, maybe it shouldn't be here, maybe it should be here, because then there are other bloggers have written about it, right? And podcasts, they're mentioned in podcasts, not only ours, but other people. And so it creates these great things, create a flood of other people talking about it, create links back to us, right? So when I wrote like a 28-page blog post on Billy Mays right after he died, we got a ridiculous amount of traffic and a ridiculous number of people linking to us and stuff like that. Now, when I first sat down to write it, I wasn't planning on writing a 28-page blog post. But I saw that no one else had, so I figured that's what I'll do. And then because of that, other people linked to it. Guthrie Ranker sent all of their employees to it. And you know, today I think if you type in Billy Mays marketing, we're #1. Now, we weren't going for that. That really, I don't think we get much traffic from it. I don't think it's a highly searched phrase. But I think too many people make this mistake of trying to do too much. And my experience has been that we've gotten our best results from the few great things that we've done, right? Where we covered all those things, plus some others, in one package of information, because it resonates on such a deep level. And I think that because most people don't take that approach, it makes you stand out that much more, right? That when someone comes across something that's substance, it's incredibly powerful, because so much of stuff out there is, as someone who reads a lot, like it's very clear to me within the first 2 chapters of a book, whether this book was written by someone who just needed to write a book or someone who loved the topic so much they wanted and needed to write the book because of that, not for just positioning purposes. For you, the people that matter most in Amazon are the people that review the type of books that you want to write, right? So someone like me, right, who easily buy at least 500 books a year, probably closer to 750 or 1,000. I was looking at a book yesterday, it seemed appealing, had a whole bunch of reviews. And then someone made the comment, because I will do this too sometimes, because I've been burned. Why are all the people that are commenting on this book, why is this their first comment, right? That's one, which is a big red flag. In other words, these are friends of the author. They've never commented on any other book before, now all of a sudden they feel this compulsion. And they all came within a 2-week period of time, right? Now this book, big red flag, right? Like, because it doesn't make any sense, right? So what you want to do, so what I do is, anytime I find a book, I'm going to first tell you what I do, then I'll translate it to you. Anytime I find a book that I wish I would have known about earlier, right? I go to the reviews and I look at the first power reviewer that wrote a really good review. Not like, I really like the book, but some people when they write a review of the book, they break it down, right? And power reviewers are in the top 500. Like they've reviewed so much stuff, they're one of the top 500 reviewers. And it shows, like power reviewer, right? When I find one of those that wrote a review about a book that I wish I would have read a while back, I had no idea it was that good, I didn't even know it was out, didn't hear about it, whatever, I go to that person's Amazon page and I sign up for their RSS feed, because you can do that. So in my RSS reader, I have this one folder called Book Reviewers, and it's all the people that have found books before me, and anytime they write a new book review, it goes into my feed, right? So for you, I would say primarily in your core topic, I don't know that you want to do this in martial arts and stuff like that, it might just be too time consuming. But definitely in your core topic, you want to find the authors that you most likely are going to be like, right? Find out who's reviewed their books first, sign up for RSS feeds on their, when you click on them, it'll take you to a page, you'll see a place where you can sign up for their RSS feeds. You want to start following their reviews so you can read the books that they're reading, but more importantly, potentially start a dialogue with some of those people, because those people will carry weight. Like as a reader who relies on the reviews of reviewers, and there's a lot of us, when a reviewer who we like, these people have followings is my point, right? Especially in certain areas, and definitely the spiritual side definitely does. It just holds a lot of there are many reviewers that I have in that folder that when they say it's a good book, I don't even need to read anything on Amazon. I'm just buying the book, like, because they get, I don't know what value it is to them, right? But I'm doing it for myself, right? And if you have some of the top reviewers of a type of genre, odds are is that there are many people who are following those reviewers, right? And that's, in my mind, that's one of the easier ways to break in. And then if you, I don't remember the name of the company, it's a division of Amazon, and I don't think it's premature at this point for you to really consider it, but I just want you to know that this exists. Whenever you see like, this book can be purchased with that book, right? Like you're looking at a book and then below it, it has some kind of deal, possibly, or they're just recommending you get the two. That's generally purchased, and it's not that expensive. So when I looked into it, and I looked into it years ago, it was like, I'm sure now it's probably based on impressions. Back then it was $750 a month. So I mean, back then when I was looking at it, I was thinking like, wow, I could be in Amazon in front of eMyth buyers. So anyone who goes to buy the eMyth book, I could have my book sitting right next to them, and if there were good reviews and like all that kind of stuff, odds are is that they'd probably buy it. So it's just a way to break out, kind of to acquire that initial momentum. If you have a good book, good reviewers, start like now reaching out, then all of a sudden you're starting to put some of those things in place, right? Like the breadcrumbs leading to your business. And I would definitely also, if I were you, I'd be studying, some of the stuff that the famous authors have done, that like serialized and like releasing chapters one at a time, and try to distinguish who's been successful because of the way they did it based on who they are. Like when Stephen King does it, it's going to be successful because of Stephen King, right? He didn't do anything new in the marketing realm. He didn't have to. But there are other authors who've done really cool stuff. So what I want to do is I want to take a break for a few minutes, and then we'll start really talking about your businesses. But before we do that, of all the things that we talked about, is any of it unclear? And would you like any further description or application that stuff as it relates to your businesses? It's okay, I'm not insulted if you don't have any, and I won't be insulted if you have 20 questions, either way, because this is your time. So, yep, good. You good, Julie? Cool. All right, so yeah, we'll take like 10 minutes and then we'll dive back in. I think we're just going to turn off the cameras and stuff, and then we'll get into what it is that we can do best for your businesses. But along those lines, if you're not clear now, you should probably be spending the next 10 or so minutes thinking about that.